Hi everyone, welcome to episode number 54 of the Bill Podcast, and in this episode we'll be going through D3JS or data-driven documents. Specifically, we'll be playing with data to kind of display it visually, whether it's graphs, pie charts, or even interactivity. D3JS is a very powerful library to do so. Now, before we start on D3JS, there are three key concepts that we should be knowing. First of all, we will be running some kind of local web server. Of course, you can run Nginx, Apache, but the one that I will be using is a simple HTTP server from Python. Next up, you definitely need to know Document Object Model or DOM, so check out the previous episode on DOM if you're unfamiliar with this topic. And lastly, we will be plotting the graphs and charts with CSS HTML as well as SVG, which makes it very powerful to kind of plot charts and make it interactive. So do go through this episode if you're unfamiliar with SVG. Finally, let's look at the main website for data-driven documents. This website consists of very powerful examples for inspiration, as well as to take note of what kind of code we can use and pick up. So it comes with the introduction, the selection, and some of the key features. But more importantly, let's also go to the GitHub page for D3JS. First of all, I would like to point out the API reference page. This is where all the functions are listed. Of course, I will be going through some of them, but really there is just so much more that it's worth taking a look at this page. And lastly, I would definitely recommend the tutorials page. Now, there are two free ebooks online that I really benefited on picking up D3JS. The first one is found in dashingd3js.com. It will even start with why data visualization, the process, building blocks. Really, I highly recommend you Dashing D3JS. The second one is an online ebook called Interactive Data Visualization for the Web by Scott Murray. Do go ahead and also buy the ebook from O'Reilly. I also benefited a lot from this ebook. So let's get started with D3JS. First of all, why data visualization? As I'm reading off from the website dashingd3js.com, it basically says if you have a bunch of numbers, it basically makes no sense until you visualize it like this. And D3JS comes with powerful functions and libraries that allows us much flexibility to plot not only graphs, pie chart, but also interactivity. So first of all, we will come to an empty folder, and I'm in my desktop right now, so why don't we open this up in Sublime Text or any text editor of your choice, and the very first file that we'll create is index.html. Great, and I'll simply include a paragraph here. Now, in order to include the D3JS library, it is just one JavaScript file. To get a copy of D3JS, of course, you can download it from the website itself, or you can simply go to cdnjs.com, one of my favorite ways to just reference it. I'll just come up right here at the top in the head tag, script, and then under source, I'll include this URL. And for this, I will be opening up the Python simple HTTP server. So let me just do that. And it looks like it's running on port 8000. And there you go, we have D3JS with no error. So the very first thing I'll do is just query D3. If the library is loaded properly, you will see this object being displayed. The second one we'll do is D3JS and then .version. So currently we are using 3.3.3. So looks like our library is loaded and we're good to go. So for the purpose of our demo, I'll just split the screen. So anytime I do any changes such as taking off this exclamation mark, of course I have to start the live reload server. It will be depicted here right away. So let's get started. The very first thing I will do is inside the script tag, this is where I will start coding the D3JS stuff. So let's say D3 and then let me select the body. Now, if you have done any kind of DOM, the syntax and the concept of chaining and everything will be really familiar. And then append and then paragraph. Let's see what happens when we do that. Now, of course, visually we will not see anything, but if we come to the elements tag, you will see that, hey, there is this new empty paragraph tag that's being added on. Here, let me add on style and let's say color, and why don't we put it as blue? Let's refresh the page, which is automatically refreshed. And now when I come at the bottom to look at the elements panel, notice that the inline styles color blue is added on. Well, obviously there is nothing displayed here because we do not have a text inside it. So why don't we display the text? So for that, we'll just chain on .text and let's just put in a text inside and let's just say, oh hi. And there you go, you have a paragraph, blue in color, saying oh hi. And yep, if you look at the elements panel right at the bottom, this is what you will see. Now for the purpose of readability, it is good to kind of write the chaining methods in this manner, each one in a new line just a bit indented. Makes it a lot more readable. Great, so now that we have added on an element, why don't we play with data? Because it's D3JS. So the very first thing I'll do is let me create a data and let me call it var elements, and it will be an array. So now that we have defined this data, how do we add this on? So building on the knowledge of how we added the paragraph, we will similarly do d3.select and then body. Why don't we select all this time? And we will select all the paragraphs, and this time we will refer to the data and let's just call it elements, and this is of course referring to the one we defined right here, and then we have to enter it, and let's append this elements to paragraph, each of them. And what about the text? Now for the purpose of demo, let's just put in elements and see how it appears. So here you will see that there are 3 of them, but the first one, the paragraph that we initially had here, is not replaced. So this is something to take note. So I will simply take away the paragraph that we already had. And now there you go, we have 3 elements because we have 3 items in the array. Well, this is not really helpful, isn't it? What we really want to display are the elements itself, or rather the data itself. So for this we will need an anonymous function. So let's add anonymous function e and then just return e. So e being each of the element, and there you go, you have hydrogen, helium and lithium. And if you come back to the elements panel, you'll also clearly see it being added by D3JS. Let's add on the index as well. So for this I will include one more parameter, and we will also return, let's say, element space, and let's say we will say I, and then colon space, and finally plus E. Let's see how it looks. And there you go, it will say elements 0, 1, 2, 3, and the elements. Of course, we do not want it to start from 0, so we can just include it as +1. And yep, there you go, we have the index +1 as well as the elements which are coming right from here. So this is a very simple example. Why don't we next play with some data that are coming from file, because when we are using large, humongous amount of data, we are obviously not going to have it written in within our script tags. It will come from a file. So we will explore 2 such files. One is CSV, comma separated values, and the other one is JSON. So let me just comment this off for our reference later on. And before anything, let me just come to the folder and create a new file, and I'll call this elements.csv. And inside here, I will include information very similar to what we already did before. But hey, guess what? Within a comma separated value, I have 2 values. First is the element name and then is a symbol. But we also need to include one more thing, and that is the title. And I'll simply say element and then symbol, or anything as you wish. Great, so now that we have a file called elements.csv, let's see how D3JS helps us access it. So the very first thing I'll do is d3.csv, and let me refer to the file elements.csv. And after this, I will have an anonymous function, and let's include it as elements as the entire data. And simply, let's just console log this, just so that we know what's going on. So once I come to the console here, and once we expand it, yep, you will see element symbol, hydrogen H, helium and He, and finally lithium and Li. Now this is not too interesting unless we can do something with it. Now building on the previous example, we will similarly add it on to the body and then select all, say paragraph, data, and why don't we also access the elements that we got from the CSV file. Enter. This should be really familiar to you by now. .text, which starts off with an anonymous function with E and I. So let's return something. So this time we will do e.element so that it can access the first column. And let's include a square bracket, and after that we'll do e.symbol. So the square bracket will contain the symbol plus, and then you close it. And once the page is automatically refreshed, you will see all your data right here. So this is a very simple example on how we can start to manipulate CSV file data. So let me comment this off. The final example on dealing with file data will be JSON. So very similarly, we will include a new file and call it elements.json. And inside here, within an array, I will include 3 lines just for the simplicity, and it's really simple. Let's see how we can use D3JS to access JSON data. So D3.json. So let's include the file name elements.json and an anonymous function. Let's just pass in elements as the data. And very similarly, let's console log the elements. And after refresh, you will also see the object here. But notice here, it will be element and symbol because this is coming from the JSON file. Once again, after console log, let's do something with the data. So very similarly, I'll do select and then body. And inside .text, as usual, let's pass in an anonymous function with element, each of the element and index I. And very similar to what we did with the CSV data, this time we'll do e.element plus open square bracket plus e.symbol. Now notice here it will be small letter as previously to the capital letter because this is what is included in our JSON file. And let's just end it off. This should not be in inverted comma, the data right here. And there you go, the data is properly displayed. So this is a very simple example on using CSV, an array, or even a JSON file. Next up, let's now visualize these data. So I've moved the previous example in a folder. Let me create a brand new file, index.html, and give it some structure. And firstly, within the script tag, let's have some data set. Something like this. Later I'll explain where this data comes from. So let's try to display this. So for this, why don't we create some styling to kind of make it look like a bar graph. So let's say for div, now we are good to go and append it. So for this, we'll do d3.select and then body. And let's append this as div, something like this. Oops, I obviously have to include the D3JS library. So there you go, you have one straight bar, which makes no sense at all. But of course, we can go to the elements, and there you go, you will see each of the bars right here. So obviously, we need some kind of margin, right? Let's just put it as 1 VW. And there you go, you see each of them. But this is obviously not so useful because we are not making use of the data. There are 8 of them because there are 8 data. So why don't we go ahead and style it? So this time we will style the height, pass in an anonymous function with data D, and let's return simply D. Well, this is not happening because we also have to include the CSS unit. Why don't we say pixel? And there you go, you will see a small chart appearing. Why don't we scale it up a little bit, and I'll just put it as VW, so just so that it is responsive. Now the cool thing is you can also have this as circle. So instead of width and height, I'm simply gonna change the style to border radius and then 50%. And let me also put the width here, say as 10 VW. Of course, you will see ovals here because this is not what we want right here. So what I'm gonna do is include the width as well and amend the height to width. So because this is in terms of viewport width, no matter what size you do, it will change accordingly. Now, if you're wondering what are these numbers exactly, well, these are the diameters of the 8 planets in our solar system. So obviously this is Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. And if you look at the elements, this is simply using the div element. Why don't we now play with SVG? So I'm just going to comment this off. And let's get a data set right here. And the first one will be diameter. The next one will be the distance from the sun in AU. And the third one will be the name of the planet. Very first thing I'll do is define the height and the width of the SVG. So let me just start with width. Let's say a very big one, and then height 700. So let's start defining the SVG, which will be D3 plus select body, and then let's append this as SVG tag, and let's give it some attribute. The very first one will be width with a value of W, which we defined previously. The next one will be height with a value H, which we also defined. Let me open up the console, and if we look here, there you go, the SVG tag is appended. Now after appending the SVG, let's try to insert in some circle tags within the SVG. So select all, say circle, data, and we'll pass in the data set. Let's dot enter, dot append, let's do it circle. And let's just have some attributes. So the very first one will be CX, the position of the X axis. And we'll pass on D, and this time we will simply return D and 1. Why D1? Because this is the second column that we are referring to, the distance from the sun. Next, similarly, we will also do CY, and this time we will pass on D and the index so that it is just displayed slightly in the Y direction. Let's just simply say I. And finally, we'll give it a fill of, say, gray. Well, nothing is happening as of now. Let's see why is it so. So let's open up the inspector panel. So all the circles, basically it's just too squished up together. So why don't we just shift it up a little bit? So let's say times 30, and maybe this time times 40. And I just added on the header one saying it's planets. And the final thing we will do is come back and add a new attribute, which is obviously the radius. And this time the radius will simply be, it will take on data, return D0. And there you go, there are the circles here. I think we can scale up the sizes a little bit, so I'll just do times 2. And maybe a little bit more prominent, I'll just say red. And there you go, the 8 planets are right here with very small dots. Now after drawing the circles, we can also go ahead and label them. So to do that, we'll do SVG dot select all and then text. Let's pass in the data set one more time. Dot enter, dot append it as text. And finally, the dot text method will pass in each of the data. And let's just return, say, D2, which is the planet name. Obviously, nothing will be seen here because we also have to describe the position. So attribute for X will be very similar to the planet circle here. So I'll just copy it right here. And so will be the attribute of Y. So it's not CY, it's just Y. And there you go. The names of the planets are right beside the dots. Of course, you can go ahead and add on more attributes such as font family and font size. So I'll just go ahead and enter and add on a few more. Something like this. Let's view it full size, how it looks like. Yep, so all the 8 planets are displayed right here along with the heading at the top. Looks like the first planet is being shifted right at the top, so we can come back right here, and why don't we displace the Y by just say 50. The circles will be displayed by 50, and let's also displace the title, the label, by 50 as well. And there you go, the 8 planets are right here with their labels right beside them. This kind of looks like a scatter plot, but you get the idea. Let's now play around a little bit with some kind of interaction. So to do this, the very first thing I'll do, come right at the top inside the body tag right after the header one, let me just add on a paragraph, and then let's just say click here. So once we click here, the interactivity will kind of start. So D3JS once again makes the interactivity very easy to write and code as well. So let's start that with D3 and select all with P, and once you've selected on, something will happen. So say on click, I'm gonna choose the SVG. Let me just align it a little bit and select all. I'll select the text. Let's move the text to the right. Let's just select the data with dataset, and let's start to transition it. And how do we transition? Firstly, we need to put a duration, very much like CSS3 animations actually. Let's just put it as 1 second. Let's also put in an ease function. How about linear? These words should be really familiar to us because of CSS3. And let's put an attribute. An attribute in terms of x-axis, let's just put it all the way to the right. So we'll return a W, which is the SVG width, and then let's say just -300. Why don't we try it out? So let's click here, and there you go, the text goes all the way to the right. Now you can also kind of course, change the ease to other values such as bounce. Let's try with bounce. So I'm going to click here, and it bounced a little bit. You can also do certain transitions only upon start or end. So let's try with end. I'm going to say end, pass in an anonymous function, and here we will do d3.select this .text function and then D, return D2. Well, D2 is the planet name. Why don't we also add on some more with size, say D0? Very simple. Let's try this out. So once you click here, all the labels will go at the right, but it will also add on more information. It will bounce, and there you go with size, something like this. Finally, why don't we also change these circles? Let's change the color and also make it slightly bigger. So this will also happen upon clicking. So we are changing the text, and apart from the text, we will also change the circle. So similarly, we will do select all, .data and dataset, .transition. Let's delay it for about 1 second. Duration also 1 second. Let's put an ease as, say, linear. So what do? We will try to fill it up with, say, brown color this time. And why don't we also change the radius, pass in the data. So we will change the radius to D0, the initial value, times, say, 5. Great, so let's try this out. So I'm going to click here, and there you go. It bounced up to a bigger radius. So this gives us a slight hint into interacting with D3JS. Of course, you can make it hover and change color, or hover and change position. Really, imagination is the possibility. Next up, let's explore scaling the values as well as adding on some axis. So I'm on a blank page. Let me just give it some outline and add on the D3JS library. Now within the script tag, I will define 3 things: the width, the height, and the padding of the final SVG element that we'll be creating. Let's also add in some data, some random numbers as a scatter plot. So this will be the x-axis and this will be the y-axis. Now with this data, let's now add on. So we'll say var SVG equals to d3.select body, and let's append this as SVG. Let's add an attribute width of W, the variable, and another attribute of height of, say, H. And of course, when we open up the console, we will see that, hey, the SVG tag is being added on. Next, we will create the line. So let's just say line function, and we'll do d3.svg.line.x and then function. And in this case, let's just simply return the x-axis, which is D0. And we will do the same thing for y. This time we will return D and 1. Finally, we will also add interpolate. This is basically the way it is being drawn, to simply linear first. Finally, let's draw it. Line graph equals to svg.append. Let's append it as a path. Let's add on some attributes. First one is D, and we'll simply put in the line function and pass on the data set. Next, we will also pass on the attribute with some styling. So say a stroke of light blue color, say a stroke width of say 5, and let's also give it a fill as none. Now once you do this, you realize very faint lines being drawn here. This is exactly why we need to scale our data, because our data is just so small that it is not taking up the entire SVG that we defined. Now before we go on, let's just add on the labels as well. So you say SVG and then select all text, and the text will simply be say D0 plus comma, basically the coordinates, plus D1. In the X direction, it will simply be the X value, of course, and the Y coordinate will simply be the Y value. And finally, I will add on some font family, font size, and the color. And as usual, you can see all the text right here all squished up at the top. Now let's add some scaling. So I'll come right at the top after SVG. Let's define the scales. So the very first one, let's define the X scale, D3.scale in this case, and let's define it simply as linear. So firstly, we need to define the domain, and it will be inside the brackets. We'll define the start. What is the start? The start will basically be D3.min, the minimum value from the data set, comma, it will also pass in an anonymous function, say with D. Let me just enter this, and it will simply return D0. So basically it will pick out the lowest in the X direction. And finally for the end, it will be something really similar. So let me just copy this, but instead of min, it will be simply max. Now I'm gonna do the same thing, but this time I'll add on the range. And the range will also consist of an array, the start and the end. So the start will be simply 0, and it will stretch to the width of the entire SVG. Now with the X scale defined, I'll also do the same thing with the Y scale. So let me just change this to Y. This time, instead of 0, I'll return D1. And of course, instead of stretching through the width, it will stretch through the height. Finally, in the line section, we cannot just return D0 and D1. We need to return the scale. So what we will do is X and then scale, something like this. And of course, in terms of Y, it will be Y scale. Let's save it. And once you save it, you will immediately see the line being stretched. Of course, my SVG is very, very big. So why don't we change it to 600? And there you go, you see the lines. And why don't we change the height to say 200, something that we can see. And there you go, it is plotted in this manner. Now, of course, we also need to change the text. So let me come back right at the bottom at the text. So in the X and the Y, we will similarly add on the scale. And of course, the Y will be Y scale. Now let's play around a little bit with the interpolate function. Now instead of linear, you can add on something like say step and then before. See how the graph changes. It will be step. If you want a smooth graph, you can also try on something called basis, and it will give us a smooth graph. But for this purpose, let's just leave it as linear. Why don't we go ahead and change the data set? This time I'll add on the world population. So let's say data set. It will consist of the year and then the world population in terms of billion. So notice here 1963 billion, 1974 4 billion. The graph actually looks a bit inverse, especially in the y-axis. So the x-axis is increasing, 1996, 74, 87, 99, but the y-axis is in the reverse order. So firstly, we will go ahead and add on the axis. So to add on the axis, let's define it. Var x-axis equals to d3.svg.axis.scale. Let's put it as x scale. Let's also put it an orient. And we of course want it at the bottom. We can also put in the number of ticks. Let's just put it as 5. Similarly, we will also do the y-axis. Let me just change this to y. Scale that it will be using is y, and let's orient it to the left. It can also use 5 ticks. Now we have defined it, but we have yet to append it. So I'll come right at the bottom and let me append it. svg.append, and this will be appended as a group. The very first thing we'll do is let's add on some class to it so that later we can style it, and we can style it as axis of class. And finally, we will simply do call x axis, and we will do the same thing for y axis. Now notice here the y-axis can be seen, the x-axis can't be seen. Let's do a little bit of transformation. So the very first thing I'll do is add an attribute called transform, and let's add translate. And we will translate from 0 to the height of the entire SVG. And then let's just close the bracket. We will also do something very similar to the y-axis. Add on the transform and then translate 0 and then 0. Now if you notice, you will not be able to see the axis still. Why is that so? Let's go ahead and look at the SVG, and you will see that, hey, it is like beyond the SVG here. So we need to transform it a little bit. So to do that, we will basically do h minus padding, and there you go. You will see the y-axis here, the x-axis here. And in terms of the y-axis, we will just shift it by padding. But we still need a little bit of adjustment. So let's go back right at the top where we define the axis here, or rather the scale here. Let's change the range this time. Obviously, it has to start from a little bit of padding, and it will also end off with the width minus the padding and times 2. And there you go. You notice that the x is starting right from here. Similarly, let's do the same thing to the y scale. So it will start off with the padding, and it will end with h minus padding. And now you see the graph is ending off correctly here. But still our y-axis is inverted. You notice that it's starting from 7. So to reverse the y-axis, we need to come to the y scale and simply reverse these two. The range will now start from h dash, or rather minus padding, and then simply end at padding. And once you do that, yep, you will see that the world population has been growing. Let me quickly go on at the bottom and add on some text to properly denote what we are saying. So year 1960, 1974, comma, and then I would like to add on the word B to denote billion. Similarly, I'll also come to the body and simply say world population. Now we can also denote, instead of line graph, we can also denote it as circles. So let's quickly see how we can make that happen. So the very first thing I'll do is comment off the line and the line graph. And instead of a line, I will simply define some circles. So svg.select all, say circle, which will take on the data from the data set, enter it and append it as a circle. We'll also have some attribute, say cx, pass on an anonymous function and return x scale, d with an index of 0. Similarly, the attribute for cy will return an index of d1 with y scale. Finally, it should also have an attribute of, say, radius, function d, return r scale, d1, but let's just times it by 2 this time, just to make it slightly bigger. And finally, the final attribute will be the fill color, and let's just have it as light blue. And of course, there is an error because we have not defined the R. So along with the Y scale and X scale, let's also define the R scale. And this will also be d3.scale.linear.domain. And it will start from 0 and it will go all the way to maximum. And I'll just copy the Y. Because y-axis is the population, I just wanted to the circle size to change as the population grows. And I will also define the range. Let's just say from 2 to 5. And there you go. The circles are there and it will grow as the population grows. As a final note for the axis, I will just add on some CSS styling. So I'll go right at the top and add on some styles. And this will basically make the axis much thinner and crisper. Now the cool thing about D3JS once again is that now you can simply replace this data with another data. Why don't we have a very similarly world population as well, but this time it will be predicting into the future. So let me comment off the previous data and add on another data set. And because we have done all the scaling and the axis stuff, yep, it will work pretty cool. Of course, the circle here is huge. So we can come back to the R scale and maybe just change from 5 to 3. But coolly enough, if you really want to see what is the population, why don't we just turn it back to the line graph. So now I'll comment the circles and make it into a line graph. Looks like there are sharp edges, so why don't I make it a little bit more curvy with the bases. And there you go. Let me just expand it and make it full view. So I'll go to the SVG here and change the width height to say 500. And there you go. You have a nice graph defined with the data and drawn with D3JS. So that was a little bit about D3JS. I hope it gave a brief overview about the power of D3JS, the flexibility, and what it can do. So for more resources, check out this Stack Overflow question on learning D3JS. There are various links and guides here. Next up, I also want to link to the book on the various other charting tools such as Data Wrapper, Google Charts, G-Raphael, Float, and many more as alternatives to D3JS. Now, as an inspiration, I wanted to link to this 1000 D3JS examples and demos. As a final note, I do want to acknowledge the author of D3JS, Mike Bostock. He has taken a lot of effort to compile a lot of examples, so do go ahead and check it out and definitely subscribe to his blog as well. He does a lot of interesting web projects. And finally, for the build link of the episode, it goes to this GitHub README, or rather Markdown file, which has a list of free programming books available online. And the list is pretty comprehensive on many programming languages, including assembly, C, or even Erlang, F#, Git, and much, much more. So definitely go ahead and check out this listing of free ebooks and have it a go. And for all other episodes of Build Podcast, do visit build-podcast.com and subscribe to Build Podcast via any one of the 6 channels: RSS, iTunes, Vimeo, YouTube, GitHub, and Twitter to get the content. And I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye.